All right, so now we're going to take a look at our consumables and read about the Transcontinental Railroad. So you need to have your consumables open to page 12, and we're going to read through this together and maybe stop to annotate some of the important key details and try to come up with maybe some main ideas. So you've already watched the video learning about the American West and the Transcontinental Railroad. So today let's gather some more information, and then you guys will end up answering some questions revolving around the key details. Okay, so let me get my pen here. All right, Building the Transcontinental Railroad by Andrea Matthews. We're going to read through pages 12 through 16 today. In 1830, the first railroad in the United States opened in Baltimore, and it had just 21 kilometers, which is 13 miles of track. Okay, that sounds to me very important. So it was in Baltimore, and it only had 13 miles of track, right? Important. Other railroad lines were built mostly in the Northeast. Soon, the East Coast was crisscrossed with train tracks connecting cities. By the 1850s, railroads were changing cities. That's important to me, right? So 20 years later, now railroads are changing cities. 20 years later, right? They're changing cities. For example, in 1850, Chicago had 30,000 people and one railroad. By 1856, the city had 10 railroads, and by 1860, its population had tripled due to the rail system. The railroads affected everyday life and how people did business. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that it's affecting everyday life and how people did business. I mean, think about it. Right, we don't necessarily take trains every day, but we drive in our cars before the coronavirus, and how does that affect our everyday life? How does this help people to do business? When I think about transportation, I think about, trucks. I think about Amazon and how many trucks I see go past my house every day as people have things being delivered. I see how people can get to the doctor because they have access to it and they can get somewhere. So people can get to work. Like, there's all kinds of things that are changing because of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? If you had family that lived in one state and you lived in a different state, now you're able to go visit them by railroad. So let's look at paragraph 3. Farmers shipped corn and wheat through Chicago by rail. Factories were built and their products were shipped to customers via the railroad. Via, I'm just going to circle, but via means by. Hotels sprang up for visiting business travelers. New housing was built for the additional workers. Suburbs grew up around areas where people used the railroads to commute to work. A few dreamers wanted to expand the railroad to the lightly settled West, but there was little demand for it, right? Supply and demand. Think about that in social studies. Where if we don't need it, then they're not going to do it, right? Then gold was discovered in California in 1848. That's important. Gold was discovered in California in 1848. Word spread and people rushed there to look for gold. They found a place that had great weather and fine soil. Soon, other people moved there to farm or start business. So they weren't able to expand the railroad because there wasn't a demand for it. But then once they discovered that California had gold, well, now there's a demand for it because everybody wants to be there. Okay? So this is gold in California. Travelers crossed the plains in covered wagons or sailed around South America to reach California. Either way, the trip took 4 months or more. People wanted a better way to travel to the West. Also, farmers and business owners in the West needed a faster way to ship their goods east. Leaders began to talk about building a transcontinental railroad. Suddenly, the dreamers' idea of joining the eastern and western coasts together began to make sense. If you take a look at these pictures, these are photos, right? They're black and white photos, so they're from a long time ago. also demonstrating that this is informational text and nonfiction. The one on page 12 says the first American steam locomotive, called the Tom Thumb, traveled at the speed of 29 kilometers, which is just 18 miles an hour. That's pretty slow. And then the trip across the country was slow, hard, and often dangerous. See, if you take a look at the picture on page 13, that's what they were using when they weren't using trains, was covered wagons pulled by horses. Okay? All right, let's keep going. On to page 14. Here's where we have a map and a quote up here that says, "A great railroad connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific Ocean is the most magnificent project ever." Right? And think about it that way. You're able to do the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean because on one side, on the west side of America is one ocean, and on the right is the other. Do you know which one is which? I challenged for you to figure out which is on the left, which is on the west of the United States, and which is on the east of the United States. But you're able to connect them because you could use a railroad to go all the way across the United States. Building a railroad across the country was a huge project. It would require money, a team of engineers, armies of workers, and a leader. Theodore Judah was a young engineer who had built railroads in the East. He believed that a transcontinental railroad could and should be built. I'm just going to write down or highlight that a railroad across the country is a huge project, right? You need money, you need engineers, armies of workers, and a leader. And then I see that we have Theodore Judah was a young engineer who had built railroads. So I have a feeling that he's going to be an important person moving forward. Let's look at paragraph 7. Judah went to Washington, D.C. to ask the government for land and money. He convinced President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. This plan set up two railroad companies. The Central Pacific Railroad Company would begin in California, laying track east. The Union Pacific Railroad Company would start at the Missouri River, laying tracks west. They would meet somewhere in the middle. Okay, so they had two companies working different directions so that they didn't have just one set of people going from west to east or going from east to west. They had two sets of people going from each side to meet in the middle, which would speed up the process of building it. Each company would receive 6,400, later doubled to 12,800 acres of land and $48,000 in government bonds for each mile of track built. The company that got the farthest would make the most money. The land and money proved a good incentive for each company to do its best to win. The Union Pacific seemed to have the easier job. It was building across flat land. The Central Pacific had to run track through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Either way, the race was on. At first, workers were asked to lay 1.6 kilometers, or 1 mile, of track per day. Then the goal became 3.2, or 2 miles per day. One day, the Union Pacific men began work at 3 a.m. and laid more than 13 kilometers, which is 8 miles, of track, making the competition fierce. Woo! So I'm going to just go back a little bit here. In paragraph 8, they were giving them money and giving them acres of land. So it seemed to be the Union. Right, so each company, I'm just trying to figure out what I want to highlight, what's the most important in paragraph 8. The companies would get 6,400 or 1,200 acres of land and 4,800 in government bonds. The company that got the farthest would make the most money. The land and money proved to be a good incentive. The Union Pacific seemed to have the easier job. It's building across flat land, right? So if it's building across flat land, that means that the Union Pacific, and we have it just on the other paragraph, but the Union Pacific is going east to west. And then we have the Central Pacific going west to east. because it was building flat land, and Central Pacific had to go over mountains. Okay, paragraph 10. However, the Central Pacific team refused to be beaten. They announced that a special team of workers would lay 16 kilometers, now 10 miles, of track per day. The men were promised 4 days' pay for 1 day of work. By 7 p.m., they had put down their tools and had laid 16.1 10 miles and 56 feet of track. So the Union Pacific was leading, but then Central Pacific was not going to be beat. So they were fighting hard to be the winning group. Let's read page 16 now. Who were these amazing workers? Many were immigrants glad to make $2 to $4 per day. So that's important. So these workers were immigrants, and they were only making $2 to $4 a day. There were Irish, German, Chinese, and Swedish workers. Others were former enslaved laborers or ex-soldiers. At the project's peak, more than 30,000 workers helped to construct the railroad. They built tunnels through mountains, laid rail across deserts, and dug through snowstorms, mudslides, and avalanches. Nothing stopped progress. And here's a picture of Chinese workers in traditional clothing excavating the track bed of the Central Pacific Railroad. The greatest contribution came from more than 10,000 Chinese immigrants who worked to finish the railroad. In addition to laying track, they were often trained to use explosives. They used dynamite to blast train tunnels and lay tracks through the mountains. This was hazardous work. Hazardous. Wonder what that means. The workers were lowered down the cliff in a basket. Yikes. He drilled a hole in the rock, inserted explosives, and then lit them. Then the worker was quickly pulled back up the cliff before the blast. Okay, I can automatically figure out that hazardous probably means dangerous, right? The worker is going down in a basket, putting a hole in the ground, sticking explosives in it, and then trying to get out of the way as fast as he can before the blast goes off. Right? Why would that help? Why does that help with laying track? I'm curious. I think we'll stop there for today to figure out why, and kind of think about why would they use explosives to help build the railroad. So now that you have read through this, again, we're sticking with our essential question about how communities are evolving. When you go to the next slide, where you're responding, you're looking for key details, okay? You're answering 4 questions. Now, when you answer these questions, I want to make sure that you are being thorough. It says use complete sentences. I also want your answers numbered 1 through 4, okay? So I know which goes with which. So complete sentences and numbering your answers. You're answering when and where the railroad opened in the United States. When was gold discovered? How did the discovery of gold in California influence leaders about the railroad? And how did the railroads change cities? I know that in reading through those pages, we have the answers to all of those questions. So that will be your task for the day. And then your other task will be to write about the Transcontinental Railroad and putting those key details into a summary. So best of luck, and I can't wait to see what you write. Come on.